So this video will be on, there it is. This video will be chapter 22, sections 2 and 3, because 2 is quite short. And we will be talking about how we use star clusters to figure out the ages of stars. So let's switch back to, that didn't work. There we go. Um, um, Star clusters and how they help us understand star evolution. Different types of star clusters, that's basically section 2. And then we will proceed. There we go. So when we look at star clusters, so these are groups of stars that exist sort of gravitationally attached to each other in the universe. They can be within a galaxy. Sometimes we find them in the halo of the galaxy, sometimes in the arms. But mathematical modeling of these clusters really helps us figure out the ages of the stars. So there's 2 different types of star clusters, and let's look at the 2 of them. Open cluster, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot today, is a few thousand loosely packed stars. They stay together because they are gravitationally attracted to each other. So our star is not in a cluster because we are not in a group that travels together. Jewel box, NGC, New Galactic Catalog 4755 is an example of an open cluster. This is a fairly young open cluster with lots of stars that are blue and a few that are yellow supergiants. They have aged off the main sequence, and that's actually what we're going to be talking about this whole chapter. This cluster is 6,400 light years away from the sun. But let's talk about, those colors in just a second. The other kind of cluster, and we'll talk about these more when we get to galaxies, is globular clusters. And here we're talking about million or more, even several million stars, tightly bound together, very close. And they are, bound together by gravity. Omega Centauri is a globular cluster, 16,000 light years away from us, contains several million stars. When we look at this image, it's not as easy to tell, but when we zoom into just the central core of this and see this image with the bright reds and the bright blues, this should remind you of the video that we looked at when we just started looking at the HR diagram, and it sorted the red from the blue and then brightness. That is the same cluster that we're talking about here. And so globular clusters will be important when we start talking about galaxies. So how does the HR diagram of a star cluster help us figure out the age? And it comes down to if we take a hypothetical young cluster with an age of 3 million years. So the stars should be all along this cluster. The largest stars are right on the main sequence because they have already finished collapsing and they are main sequence stars. These over here in this little arc are still condensing. They have not yet started fusion, so they are protostars and they are contracting toward the main sequence, the zero-age main sequence. When we look at a particular open cluster, in this case NGC 2264, this one's called the Christmas tree, 2600 light years away from us, and so we see this beautiful image, and the gases in the cluster are ionized by the hot stars in there, and so we see the gases glowing red, and then the lines in here, those are dust that are obscuring our view, but you know, this is this particular globular cluster, open cluster. This is an open cluster. So we look at the HR diagram of this cluster, and we see that we have a bunch of stars that are way over here on the right side that are probably still condensing to the zero-age main sequence. We have stars, you know, all up and down on the main sequence. And so if we look at the theoretical location of stars, and the actual location of stars, we see a very nice, you know, satisfying symmetry between, or similarity between these two. So this starts to support our, you know, idea that stars condense onto the main sequence and they spend a lot of their lives on the main sequence. And then they move off the main sequence when they get old. And so how do we figure out how old they are? The reason that open clusters work for us is that all of the stars in an open cluster formed at the same time from the same massive dust cloud. And so if they all are approximately the same age, but they behave differently on the HR diagram because of their mass, then we start being able to identify that, yes, our HR diagram is useful. So the most massive stars will use up their fuel quickly and move off the main sequence earlier, and the lower mass stars will stay on the main sequence much longer, and then we can see that as they move off the main sequence, stars actually become redder. So here we have cluster M41, much older than the cluster that we just looked at, and so we have stars that have moved up here into the red giant region, and you can see that right here the cluster, it's called, turns off the main sequence. So these are stars that have are using up the hydrogen in their core, and they are moving up into the red giant phase, and swelling up and getting redder as they do this. And so, zero-age main sequence, and different stars or different clusters have different turnoff points. So if the turnoff point for a cluster is way up here, then that cluster is only roughly 100 million years old, because stars up here in the more massive portion of the main sequence age faster and turn off faster. If we see a cluster that the turnoff point is way down here in the bottom portion of the main sequence, we know that the cluster, all of the stars in there, are roughly 10 billion years old, because, where'd my cursor go? because that is the point where the stars turn off. Um, so the next section that we will talk about is what happens as a star runs out of hydrogen and starts fusing helium, and what happens in those stages. So how do these low mass stars die?